pleased to present the 2021 ASCB Public Service Award to Donna Ginther and Raynard Kington for, as their awards say, leadership in alerting the scientific community to significant racial disparities in research funding at the U.S. National Institute of Health, the NIH. The U.S. scientific community has, unfortunately, a troubled relationship with the Black community in America. We cannot forget that between 1932 and 1972, the United States Public Health Service conducted a study on 600 Black men to, in quotes, record the natural history of syphilis, knowingly allowing them to suffer and die from a terrible disease and treatable disease. Unjust treatment of Black Americans by the scientific community is not relegated to the past. Black Americans and other members of minority groups have been chronically underrepresented in clinical trials for treatment ranging from cancer to COVID. Sickle cell anemia and other diseases more common in African American community are significantly underfunded relative to diseases that affect similar numbers of other people. These problems contribute to significant disparities in health outcomes across the board. There are also struggles within our own community. Despite the age-old wish that science be a meritocracy, it's just not the case. It's also not the case that science is representative of the United States or even those who wish to be scientists. At each stage in their career of a scientist, Black representation within the scientific community gets smaller and smaller. For proof, look no further than group pictures from department retreats or small meetings. We have yet to undo the histories and legacies that disproportionately impact scientists of color. That is why the papers published by Raynard Kington and Donna Ginther and their colleagues are so important. With the first paper published in Science in 2011 and in PLOS ONE in 2018, they assigned data to these group photos and began the essential task of demonstrating the inequities in the NIH funding system. The Ginther-Kington et al. Papers resulted in the creation of two successive working groups within the leadership of NIH. The second group has been actively working since 2013. But more work still needs to be done. More inclusive and equitable science will support the development of sustainable diversity in the scientific workforce. And those efforts can't be limited to formal federal government meetings. The work needs to extend to our labs, our own departments, and to our professional societies.
Thank you, Ruth. Holly?
So sometimes it takes a spotlight to make us see what we should have been able to see by looking inside ourselves. Such was the case last May as the whole world watched in horror as a Minneapolis police officer murdered George Floyd during an arrest for suspected passing of a counterfeit $20 bill. The casualness with which that police officer stole Mr. Floyd's life changed America. That videotaped crime opened many eyes that had not been seeing or chose not to see the everyday injustices that must be addressed by our friends, neighbors, and colleagues of color. Driving while Black, modern-day Jim Crow laws, the Miami medical doctor handcuffed in front of his own home as he loaded supplies for the local homeless shelter. As our colleague Derek Applewhite wrote in his superb ASCB blog post earlier this year, society's problems are our own problems. Not only must we make the funding system more equitable, as shown by Drs. Kington and Ginther, we must recognize the corrosive effects that we as individuals can have on the career paths and lives of our colleagues of color by the daily injustices of failing to cite them, excluding them from leadership positions, not selecting them to give talks, and saddling them with too much service work. So now that we see, what are we going to do? The responsibility is now in our hands as individuals and also as PIs, grant reviewers, department chairs, and members of professional societies. At the ASCB, a task force of ASCB members from all career stages and institution types came together in late 2020 and has led the development of an action plan to help improve diversity, equity, and inclusion at ASCB. We are taking this plan very seriously, and hopefully the results of that work are already visible at this year's meeting. We know that our work has just begun. The responsibility to fix the problems isn't the task force, and it shouldn't fall on the shoulders of our colleagues who are most negatively impacted. We have each to rethink how we operate as individuals, as members of labs, departments, professional societies, and citizens of the world. Drs. Ginther and Dr. Kington, thank you for shining that light that helped us see our failures.
Thank you, Holly. Dr. Kington, would you like to give some remarks?
Sure. So it really is a great honor for me to receive this award along with my incredible colleague, Dr. Ginther. I thought I would take a minute just to give some background about how this work came about. I was the principal deputy director at NIH, and one of the senior staff made an appointment to speak with me about data on the diversity of NIH grant recipients. And I remember this conversation distinctly. The staffer came into my office with several sheets of paper of tables on the racial and ethnic makeup of principal investigators of NIH R01 grants, along with applicant funding rates by race and ethnicity. And the findings, the disparities in funding rates by race and ethnicity, and the persistently low percentage of PIs, particularly who are African American, the findings were deeply troubling. And we quickly reached the same question: should these data be released? To be honest, there was real concern about the potentially stigmatizing impact of the data. And I felt strongly that it would be irresponsible to just release the data without analysis or any commentary. I also felt strongly that we had an obligation to understand more about what these data were telling us about how we were meeting our mission of advancing biomedical and behavioral science to improve the health of the nation and the world. We decided in that moment that we would initiate a project to analyze the data and explore potential explanations, and then to release the data along with an analysis aimed at explaining why these patterns existed and offering some ideas about how we might go about addressing the differences. Now, I forget the details from there, but ultimately it became clear that we didn't have the in-house capacity to conduct analysis. And I asked around for names of social scientists who might lead such a study, along with the internal staff. And eventually someone, and I forget who, suggested Donna Ginther, who said she was a great researcher who was already experienced in related areas of research. And I called her, and we quickly agreed to a project, and we were off. The paper in Science that came from that analysis really was a group effort, and I want to acknowledge the work of our co-authors. By the time it was published, I had left NIH to become president of Grinnell College, but I continued my involvement with a series of studies that came from that conversation and building one on the NIH campus. I tell the story to point out that this project never would have happened if I had not been confident that NIH was a place that was actually open, albeit sometimes with a little bit of prodding, to asking hard questions of itself and going about the work of answering those questions in a rigorous way. I was also confident that my boss, Ilya Serhuni, would also support the work because it was perfectly consistent with his demand that the agency begin to learn more about how effectively it was going about meeting its mission. NIH really is a jewel in the crown of the federal scientific enterprise. And I've been so impressed about how NIH has responded to the challenges highlighted by this work. And they've recognized that there aren't simple stories explaining this, and there aren't simple interventions that can quickly make these differences go away. Now, the coverage of this paper and later research provided a perfect example of different experiences of scientists based on race. When one article was published related to a later paper that reached somewhat different conclusions, 5 scientists were mentioned in this article. And yet I was the only scientist who was identified by race. Now, to their credit, the publishers of that article, having received a scathing email from me about this difference in treatment, invited me to write an op-ed in response, and I did. And in that op-ed, I noted that the selective information about my race and not about the race of any other scientists in that paper, intentionally or not, planted a seed of doubt about my objectivity. My conclusion, that if you took that one small instance of how I was treated differently because of my race and multiply it by a few thousand times, one can easily see how you might get very different pathways in outcomes of scientists from different racial and ethnic groups. I know that there are many scientists who felt almost personally insulted by the implications and sometimes the misinterpretation of that original paper. But over time, I've been impressed with the shift in thinking of many people in the scientific community. More and more scientists acknowledge our failure as a community to make sure that bright minds will have the opportunity to contribute to the advancement of science, no matter where they might be in our society. And more scientists see that this failure is a serious threat to the long-term success of our nation's scientific enterprise. I hope that our receipt of this award will again highlight the importance of this work. Thank you again.
Thank you, Dr. Kington. Dr. Ginther.
Well, thank you. It's tough to follow up those comments. So I can share my perspective. I'm both honored and very surprised to receive this award. It's very humbling to be in such august company for the sharing it with Dr. Kington and the previous recipients. So I'm very pleased and honored to receive the award. And it comes at a time, it's 10 years after the paper came out. And the paper went out and it kind of went around the world. It made, front page news around the world. And it was very transformative of my career. And I want to take the opportunity to thank Dr. Kington and his colleague, Wally Schaefer at NIH and Lori Hack, who sort of connected us and gave me the opportunity to do this work. And there are co-authors at Clarivet Analytics who actually did a lot of heavy lifting with the data because this really was a team effort and this work actually continues. There are several implications of this research that I want to point out to people. There's been a lot of controversy about whether or not there was bias in the review process coming out. We had this gap. We couldn't explain it in our 2011 paper. And then the people jumped to the conclusion that there was bias. And then we did the 2018 paper where we explained a lot of it as a function of how many papers researchers were publishing. And I think the 2018 paper points to important areas for intervention that have, up to now really been overlooked, because we show that what happens is that Black or African-American researchers publish the same number of papers at the PhD level and at the postdoc, but starting at the postdoc, those papers aren't cited at the same way as white researchers. So what is it about their research that kind of creates this disadvantage that accumulates over time and creates a very wide gulf between them being successful at NIH funding? So, we pointed out where you need to intervene, and then some other work that I've done shows that mentoring is very powerful at improving the lives of women economists. So we ran a randomized controlled trial of mentoring and found that women who received the mentoring treatment published papers in top journals, and were more likely to get research grants. And so that type of mentoring approach at the early career stage was very transformative and allowed women to get tenure in top 100 PhD institutions. So I feel that, the scientific community can take some of the lessons from our research and use it to define interventions, and create interventions to make people more successessure. This award also gave me the opportunity to actually write sort of a retrospective on the work. And one of the things that I said in my essay was that if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. And so I'm glad that with the Unite initiative that came out of NIH, they're going to finally release the data on success rates by race, because in 2011, we had the data, but nobody else did. And then NIH researchers have done subsequent papers, but their numbers and our numbers, the way they did the numbers, you can't really compare and see whether or not we've made progress. So it'll be nice to actually see the data because, you know, science is empirical, and you can't really fix the problem if you don't know the magnitude of the problem and who's getting funding. So I'm welcoming NIH's announcement that it is going to provide the data, and they should also give the data to researchers. So other people beyond NIH and beyond my rare opportunity to get access to NIH data can take a look and inform policy. And finally, you know, there's the larger issue that you mentioned about health disparities in this country. And one of the implications, one of the follow-up papers found that the institutes where applications from Black researchers are assigned receive less funding, right? So one easy way to address this problem is for more research funding on health disparities. And when we think about health disparities, we have to move a bit beyond cell biology to think about the social science and how the social science interacts with our genes and our health to generate these health disparities, because race is a social phenomenon, and the discrimination and the bias by race needs more investigation if we're going to close these health disparities. So again, I'd like to thank the ASCB for this award. I'm very honored, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. And you said you had your award with you?
Yes, I do. It's very nice. It's very big. And it's beautiful. Thank you very much.
Oh, great. Thank you very much. That's great. Thank you both very much for your time. This is a very important issue to the ASCB. And we're really very honored to have you join us. And thank you, Holly, and you, Ruth, for also giving us your time today.